The trial is underway, and two former executives from JEA are in the spotlight. Many feel they tried to get away with millions from taxpayers. What will the court find? It's one of the big local stories we're looking at today. Government law attorney Chris Hand joins us. We're also examining the plan to use pension money as a loan to finance the stadium of the future. Local, state, and national politics on This Week in Jacksonville. So glad you're with us. It's time for our once-a-month show we call Hand on Government, because Chris Hand, government law attorney, former chief of staff for the city of Jacksonville. You've got this experience at the local, state, and federal level. So always great to talk to you about a variety of issues. Let's start local here. And one of the things that is big, headlines everywhere, these JEA former executives on trial. Our colleague Rick Mullaney had described it 2019. This could be the biggest scheme to take money from taxpayers. I mean, this is a big deal that we're finally seeing it at trial, right?
Well, a long anticipated process. This has been a long and winding road to get to this point, Kent. As you know, the JEA sale process or disposition process started back in 2019, ended in 2020. The former CEO, Aaron Zahn, and former chief financial officer, Ryan Wanamaker, were indicted in the first half of 2022. So now 2 years later, their trial has begun. They had jury selection and opening statements this week, now going to be in the heart of the trial for the next 4 weeks as two separate juries, one for Mr. Zahn and one for Mr. Wanamaker, determine if they are guilty of the conspiracy and fraud charges that federal prosecutors have brought.
So, and you're an attorney, but help people see that broader context. Hey, it didn't even happen. There wasn't a sale. Nobody ripped off the taxpayers. Why is this important to follow through with?
Well, because of the charge sort of relates to the information that that allegedly Mr. Zahn and Mr. Wanamaker gave to the JEA board about what the size of a bonus plan would be. It's called the Performance Unit Plan or Performance Bonus Plan. And what it would have done is assigned essentially shares of JEA to different employees who then, when the entity sold, would have been able to cash out those shares for potentially very large sums of money.
In the hundreds of millions of dollars, right?
Well, potentially. I mean, again, depending on what the size of the shares was. And part of the charge relates to what federal prosecutors are saying Mr. Zahn and Mr. Wanamaker did and did not relay to the JEA board, the fiduciaries of JEA, to determine whether or not they should approve this plan. Both that and both on what the financial health of JEA was during the overall sale. So again, the charge comes down ultimately to fraud, false statements made with the purpose of inducing others to act on those statements. Federal prosecutors say the statements that were made to the JEA board were false, and that's the basis for part of these charges.
So why pursue that? Why is it important to find out for sure from a jury of our peers whether or not that fraud happened?
Well, I think Rick Mullaney, as you quoted him earlier, summed this up very well. This potentially could have had a massive impact on taxpayers and ratepayers in this community. Everyone in the city of Jacksonville, or almost everyone in the city of Jacksonville, and people in some outlying counties as well, are all JEA customers. They rely on this municipal water and electric service for their utilities. Well, had this occurred, would have had a massive financial impact on taxpayers and ratepayers in this community. Remember, trials are a truth-discovering exercise, Kent. This is an opportunity to find out exactly what happened with witnesses under oath, to find out ultimately what happened. Did this alleged fraud occur? And if so, the juries then weigh guilt and evidence according to a beyond a reasonable doubt standard.
Well, even the idea of looking into a sale of JEA when the utility is owned by the municipality, by the taxpayers, even that was a little iffy. You know, a lot of people were saying, I don't know if we even want to explore this. So you take it further, and what these charges relate to in this bonus plan, it seems clear why it's important to follow through and learn more about.
Well, and Kent, just to really quick, remember how this all started. It started because the city council auditors, one of the most important functions of City of Jacksonville government, were looking at documents related to the sale and managed to catch that this performance unit plan had been installed in there. That led to a city council investigation, ultimately to criminal investigations, and now to this trial now. So the folks in the City Council Auditor's Office a huge part of discovering this potential bonus plan.
So I was going to move on, but it just brings to light that there's a lot of layers to this. We've heard opening statements so far. We're just kind of getting into the trial part of this. Do you expect any bombshells? Are we going to see smoking guns that other people in the administration or throughout the city were involved in this?
Well, I think at this point, 2 years into this legal proceeding, there's a fairly good sense of where federal prosecutors are going. Remember, there's been all sorts of preliminary hearings to talk about evidence and efforts to try and exclude evidence from the trial. Yep. And what that process gives us is a fairly good preview of what the federal prosecutor's case is going to be and what Mr. Zahn and Mr. Wanamaker's respective defenses are going to be. So I don't know that there will be bombshells. There certainly could be more details that we learn at this point, but the thrust of this effort, I think, is something we've learned a lot about over the last 2 years.
So we've been learning about the impact of pandemic and just some time here on what happens in downtown development. So we reported this week, we even saw a headline from our news partner, the Jack's Daily Record, record costs sinking big projects in downtown Jacksonville. So we're talking about the former landing site, the former courthouse site, and there were projects approved by the Downtown Investment Authority, and now those are up in the air because costs have skyrocketed.
Well, I think there's a variety of factors, Kent, just to sort of frame it up. One is definitely the impact of inflation and the impact of construction and other development costs. But also, you mentioned the pandemic. Downtowns across the country have a changed relationship following the pandemic. More people working remotely, fewer people working downtown. So that's had an impact on downtowns all around the United States, not just in Jacksonville. But we're seeing those impacts in a variety of different projects. As you alluded, both the Jacksonville Daily Record and the Jacksonville Business Journal have done a lot of reporting on this issue. There were plans to build a 44-story residential tower on the former landing site. That has now gone away. There were plans to build a 22-story.
Here's some of the renderings from the former landing site.
Exactly. This one we're showing now, a 22-story mixed-use facility on the former courthouse site. That has now gone away. There were plans to revitalize some historic buildings in the west part of downtown, the old Ambassador Hotel, the Independent Life Building. According to the DIA, those developers have now defaulted on their agreements with the Downtown Investment Authority. There are several other projects that seem delayed. There was a plan to build a mixed-use project on the site of the former River City Brewing Company on the South Bank. There's now an effort to try to forge a new agreement between the city of Jacksonville and those developers. The Laura Street Trio, 3 historic buildings right in the core of downtown Jacksonville. That is also still on hold while negotiations take place. And we just learned in the last few days that the Museum of Science and History, which is supposed to move from the South Bank to the North Bank, has now asked for additional time to raise the money it needs to help facilitate that move. So I think this is not necessarily dissimilar from what we're seeing in other places, but while there certainly has been some good news downtown, such as the revitalization of Friendship Fountain, a lot of these development projects are either now going off the board or seem to be stuck at the moment. Something definitely to watch going forward.
Well, 2 more local issues I want to talk about, but stay with us. And as we continue our conversation with Chris, in a moment, we're going to expand our talk about state issues as well, including some legislation regarding elections and what that means for voters in 2024 and maybe 26. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
And Chris Hand is with us today as we tackle some of these local issues. We're going to get to the state issue in just a second. But there's this idea that for the stadium of the future, the renovation or rebuild completely of the Jaguars Stadium there, that maybe the city would borrow from the Police and Fire Pension Fund. Where does this land in terms of a policy decision potentially?
Well, Kent, this brought back a lot of memories because for the 4 years that I was at City Hall, we were really immersed in some of these pension issues for the city of Jacksonville. What the city has is an idea they're exploring. They've made very clear. Former Chief Financial Officer and Jaguars negotiator Mike Weinstein has made it clear this is just an idea. But the idea of borrowing some portion, the city is expected to contribute somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion to this renovated stadium. Some portion portion of that, the ideas, would come from the city's pension funds. This is an idea that has been met with some controversy for a number of reasons. One is, if you look at the actuarial or the financial report of the Police and Fire Pension Fund, and remember what we're talking about, this is the fund, the source of funds to help make sure that city employees' pensions are paid over the long term for the many years of work they've put in, including first responders like police and fire. But the idea would be to borrow a portion of these funds, somewhere between 250 and 500 million, from the pension funds. Just to put that in some perspective, the latest actuarial report from the Police and Fire Pension Fund shows that it has an unfunded liability. Its liability meaning how much it has to have to pay future pension obligations. It has an unfunded liability of somewhere between $1.5 billion and $2.8 billion, depending on exactly how you count that. Right now, it's only about 45% funded. The kind of benchmark, or at least as it was several years ago, the benchmark for what is a healthy pension fund is about 80% funded or more, so this is significantly less than that. And if you look at the projections over the next several years, a decade from now, the Police and Fire Pension Fund is still projected to be 45% funded, so no progress over the next decade. So that has caused some concern among folks that, hey, at this time where the pension fund's underfunded, where it still has a significant unfunded liability, why would we take funds out of the fund in order to help pay for a renovated stadium?
Yeah, that unfunded liability, isn't the city of Jacksonville still on the hook for that?
Correct.
I mean, we wouldn't see the Police and Fire Pension Fund say, oh, we're bankrupt, we can't pay these pensions, right?
Well, exactly right. The city is on the hook for that. And again, this is money the city is going to need over the long term to pay these pension benefits. What's also interesting about the idea that's been recommended is the city would pay the pension fund back at 6.5%, which is the fund's expected rate of return. Sometimes it makes more than that expected rate of return. Last year, it made a little less than that expected rate of return and lost about $55 million in investments last year. But the city would pay a higher rate of return than it could get on the open market. Cities can usually borrow money for less because they have the benefit of what's called tax-free financing. So another question that's been raised about these pension funds is, why would we pay 6.5% when we can actually pay less on the open market and potentially lower the cost to taxpayers? So again, I'm not suggesting there are conclusions to all of these questions yet, but there have been some concerns raised in the aftermath of this idea being generated.
Well, we'll see how this plays out. There are some months to go as negotiations happen and everything. Last week, we had the school board chairman, Darrell Willey, with us. And one of the things I asked him about was the restarting the process for finding a superintendent of schools. This is a pretty important issue for Duval County.
Well, it's hugely important. The person they select as superintendent will be the chief executive officer of one of the largest school districts in Florida for the foreseeable future. So it's a process that the school board actually started last fall and really found that they had a tough time identifying candidates. One of the reasons was it was in the middle of the school year, and apparently there was some concern on the part of potential candidates as to whether they could leave their current jobs in the middle of the year. But I think there was also some concern about the political environment that has developed here in Florida around schools, and maybe that has dissuaded some people from applying. But they're going to restart the search now. It starts on March 15th, the Ides of March. Beware the Ides of March. That's when that search will start, with the goal being to have a new superintendent in place over the summer in anticipation of the next school year.
We'll see if Julius Caesar presides over this search
exactly.
here. Let's turn to a state issue, and one of those things that I wanted to bring up is that there's some legislation that I saw is just kind of introduced even this last week. The Florida House basically trying to reduce the number of mail-in ballot drop boxes for 24 and then bring back or revive a primary runoff in 2026. That's the next time we'll be electing a governor in the state of Florida.
Really an interesting proposal, Kent, that just came up. It was a surprise. You know, we're in the second half of the legislative session now, so I think a surprise to many, which would do a couple of different things. One, as you say, I think of concern to some voting rights advocates is the idea that this would restrict the number of drop boxes, places where people can drop off their mail-in ballots as opposed to having to put them in the U.S. mail. As of right now, there's sort of a broader definition of where those drop boxes can be located. This bill would limit it to the Supervisor of Elections office and early voting sites. So it would kind of focus it there. There's some concern on the part of voting rights advocates that that would deny people opportunities of places to drop off their ballots. But there's a couple other very intriguing changes. One would move up Florida's primary date. Right now it's the last week in August. This would move it up to June, kind of the middle of June, and as you say, put back into place something that Florida had for many years, which was a runoff to ensure that whoever is the nominee of their party for a particular office, like governor or a member of the cabinet, would have to get 50% plus one of the vote in order to advance to the general election.
And this went away after the 2000 election, is that right?
That's right. It sort of went away in the first half of the 2000s, and since then, you could win a gubernatorial primary with a plurality, having the most votes but not a majority, and as a result would advance to the general election. So there's been some concern among members of both parties about what the impact of that has been over time. So this proposal offered by the State Affairs Committee of the Florida House of Representatives would bring back that runoff. We'll see if it gets any traction here in the remaining weeks of the 2024 session.
Yeah, you make a good point, because pretty soon the session is going to be over, first part of March. All right, stay with us, please. Presidential politics in a general election year. Chris and I look at what's happening and the strategy for the leading candidates. Stay with us on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
And this segment with Chris Hand, we're looking at the national political scene. And before we get to presidential politics, so the state of Alabama, the Supreme Court made a ruling this week that a lot of us thought, wow. The court rules that frozen embryos are children, and there are some pretty widespread impact there. Some would say a chill to in vitro fertilization, and the clinics there in the state of Alabama saying this might be a risk we wouldn't want to take.
Well, Ken, this is a direct result of a U.S. Supreme Court decision from obviously a couple of years ago, the Dobbs decision that, at that point overturned Roe v. Wade and returned the question of reproductive rights to the states to determine. State of Alabama, through its legislative actions, has significantly restricted abortion access there. And just this past week, as you say, the Alabama Supreme Court has ruled that that also applies in cases of in vitro fertilization, or IVF, where in situations where couples have a tough time conceiving naturally, where doctors and scientists use procedures to fertilize eggs and try and conceive that way. It's a process that obviously many people have used to have children in this country and around the world. Well, that process, particularly in some significant Alabama medical institutions now, is halted while people study the effects of this decision, which has said that those fertilized embryos under Alabama law, they've declared are children and have rights. And so that has, again, at a couple of major medical centers, the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and some others, have halted the process of IVF. It's caused significant concern among reproductive rights advocates around the country, and is going to be an issue in the presidential campaign. Already this week, we've had presidential candidates commenting on this particular decision. So we'll have to see how the law in Alabama develops and if this goes over to other states as well.
Well, when the Dobbs decision came down that summer, we thought, oh, this is going to be an important point when it comes to the presidential campaign. So one of the things that we're walking through, and full disclosure, we don't have results from South Carolina at the time of our visit today, but the South Carolina primary, Nikki Haley, the former governor there, not expected to win, but she said this week, hey, the election will be on Saturday. I'll still be running for president on Sunday. What does that really mean, or what's the impact of Nikki Haley saying, I'm going to keep running even if I'm not getting to wins in a caucus or a primary?
Well, it makes it very hard for former President Donald Trump to turn the page on the Republican primary and have the general election essentially start now. You're right, we don't have results as we sit here today, but if the results ended up matching what the polls said, Donald Trump, before the primary, was leading Nikki Haley in her home state in polls more than 2-1, was primed to have a 30 to 35 percentage point victory. The next major stop in this process is on March the 5th, approximately 10 days away. That's so-called Super Tuesday, where 17 states from sea to shining sea all over the country are going to be voting in their presidential primaries. If Donald Trump continues his run of success was on Super Tuesday. At that point, I think it will be very challenging for Governor and Ambassador Haley to stay in the race, because at that point he may have an insurmountable delegate lead in the Republican nomination contest. But as you say, she's made it very clear that South Carolina is not the last stop in her presidential contest. She plans to keep going forward.
Yeah. President Joe Biden, obviously, he's the sitting president, so he's got a job to do, and campaigning. We saw him even go to California, some fundraising this week. Former President Trump, yeah, he's campaigning, and it seems like a full-time job defending himself in these various court cases. What's the impact of that as we steam toward, obviously, the summer will be the national political conventions, but then that election in November?
Well, this is one of the earliest general elections we've seen in quite some time in American politics, and it almost feels like the campaign hasn't really ended from 2020 when we had these same two nominees on the ballot. So, what will happen going forward is, again, once former President Trump solidifies the Republican nomination, attention will turn to a variety of topics. Who will he select as his running mate? It seems fairly likely he will not repeat the decisions he made in 2016 and 2020 and have Mike Pence as his running mate. He'll have somebody new at that point. So we'll find out who he has as his running mate, and we'll now see this direct contest between the current president, Joe Biden, and the former president, Donald Trump. Again, something else that we've not seen very often in American politics, which is a current president and a former president on the ballot at the same time. It's happened before, but not very often.
Yeah, so much speculation about what could happen and if either the former president or the current president will be the nominees of their party, but we'll have to see. Love to see you. Chris Hand, thanks for the time today. Always great to have you here.
Good to see you, Kent. Thank you.
So we told you last time about our guest next week. Nancy Hogshead Maker is a scholar, author, expert, and gold medal winning Olympian. She'll be here, and we're going to talk about some developments concerning access and equality in athletics. And thanks for watching This Week in Jacksonville. You can also watch or listen to a brand new episode of This Week in Jacksonville Business Edition. So in that podcast, we focus on economic development in our region. And this time, we're including Jacksport and the massive economic impact it makes. You can find new episodes every Thursday at 9 a.m. on News4Jax Plus under the channel This Week in Jacksonville.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.